How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Grail or Garbage, the series where I systematically and categorically rank and review knives to give you the context that you need to decide if a knife deserves a spot in your pocket. Here's how it works. We got 5 categories: materials, ergonomics, fidget factor, the lock, and then of course fit and finish. Each category is worth a max of up to 10 points, and at the end we'll add them all up and put them on our public leaderboard so that you'll know for certain once and for all, is it a grail or is it garbage? Let's go. This is the Curvaceous, and this is a knife that we've had in our possession long enough to be able to adequately give it a rank. And this knife was, of course, sent to me for review by White Mountain Knives. So once again, shout out to White Mountain Knives. I definitely appreciate the support, and I've got to send this one back. But before we do, we have to give it a rank. So let's start off with the first category, which is materials. Now, materials isn't just what the knife is made out of. It also has to do with how much it cost. And this is kind of a weird topic for this knife because there's a couple different variants where you can get it, for example, with carbon fiber handle scales. And that one's pretty cool. It's also a bit more expensive. But also the price difference between this at White Mountain Knives and this same exact knife at Blade HQ, for example, is insanity. And also at Knife Center. I'm just going to base this off of the price at White Mountain Knives since they're the ones that sent it to me. And no surprise here, they are the most reasonable price for this knife. At White Mountain Knives, this comes in at $220. At Blade HQ, this comes in at $297, just to give you an idea. Let's go ahead and base this off of that $220 price tag. And without further ado, let's talk about it. So you have a titanium frame with G10 overlays, and it creates this bolster type lock. You have 20 CV on the blade, a titanium backspacer, and titanium pocket clip. So these are some pretty decent materials. I love having titanium on the frame. You can see there that there is in fact a steel lock bar insert, and bolster locks are definitely one of my favorites. For the $220 price tag, I do feel like that is a fair price for these materials. And with the Jade G10, it does offer the opportunity to writ dye these overlays whatever color you want. I definitely love the idea of that. 20 CV is pretty dang premium, so there's no complaints there. Overall, it's going to be getting a 8 out of 10 for materials. Next up, we have ergonomics. How does it feel in the hand? Does it feel good? Is there any hot spots? What about the pocket clip? Does the pocket clip cause an ergonomic issue? Can you switch up your grip? Well, let's talk about it. So these ergonomics are great. Now, there is a pretty deep finger groove for your index finger, but that really helps in locking in this hand. In fact, the ergonomics feel really, really good on this knife. And a lot of it has to do with that deep finger groove, as well as the flipper tab that pops over. It almost feels like a proper hilt. And I think that that's really neat. As far as a reverse grip goes, it also works well in a reverse grip because of the same reason. That hilt right there is nice, and the slight curvature at the end of the handle scales provides a nice spot for you to rest your thumb for some extra support in case you need to jab this into anything. The pocket clip itself does not pose an issue whatsoever. It is nicely finished and knocked down and contoured, and so it literally disappears in your hand, which is what a pocket clip should do, or at least one that's well designed as far as ergonomics are concerned. These are all really good. My only complaint is that we have no jimping here on the spine of the blade, so for a saber grip, it's not necessarily the most grippy. I know that that would have interrupted the design flow, and the designer Eric Oakes, I'm pretty sure that he thought that it was unnecessary because it's not hard to install jimping, and a lot of people are even capable of doing this themselves. But I do think that it's an oversight, considering that he is one of those designers that tells people that they should use his knives. Well, if you're going to use the knife, there should be some jimping right there because it's natural for your thumb to rest on the spine of the blade when you use it. So it could have gotten a better score had there been jimping. And some people might disagree with my opinion on that, but you know what? This is my opinion and this is my context. Still, the ergonomics are really, really good. There are no sharp edges that shouldn't be sharp, and it feels wonderful in the hand, and you feel nice and locked in. As you can tell, I've got a full 4-finger grip here, no problem whatsoever. And for those reasons, it's going to be getting an 8 out of 10 for ergonomics. Next up, we got to talk about the fidget factor, and this is a really important category because fidget factor is more than just deployment options, although the amount of deployment options definitely will play a role today. Fidget factor also has to do with things like how crispy is the detent? What about the acoustics, the action itself when opening and closing? Is it smooth? How well does the deployment option that we're given work? And that last one is important because we only have one. Now, my rule of thumb is when you have one dedicated deployment option, it has to be good, and it has to be really good. And in this case, it is. When you deploy it, it snaps out like a whip, and it makes a really nice sound. It's kind of like a sharp crack. And that just, I love that. Something about acoustics is just like the icing on a cake. There's no complaints here as far as acoustics. Part of the reason why that flipper tab is really good is because the detent itself is nice and crisp. I cannot necessarily fail this knife. The moment you break detent, it's going to come out even lightly, and that was very light. If you push button this, it's going to work really well, and if you light switch it, even better. There's a slight amount of jimping on the flipper tab itself, and that actually does help with the ergonomics that I mentioned before, but that's the only jimping on the blade. As far as the detent is concerned, it's really nice. As far as the action is concerned, it is running on a single-sided captive pivot and ceramic bearings, and so that just looks and feels phenomenal. It doesn't take much at all to get this to drop shut, and it feels really, really smooth. It's one of the benefits of bead blasting a blade instead of stonewashing or DLC coating or doing a satin finish, is because the bearings on that pivot aren't really meeting a whole lot of resistance, and neither is the detent ball, and that really helps and aids in a nice, smooth, satisfying action. With all of that being said, I do wish that it had at least one more deployment option. Instead of having Eric Oakes' name right there, and while I don't necessarily mind that tiny text, I do think that we could have fit a deployment hole or possibly even given access to a fuller. A fuller on this may have looked a little weird, but an extra deployment option would have really, really made the icing on the cake. There is absolutely nothing wrong, and in fact that flipper tab is one of the best flipper actions that I felt on a knife, but it's not enough to carry it the whole way for me, because I do find myself wishing that there was at least one more deployment option, and for that reason it's going to be getting a 7 out of 10 for fidget factor. Let's talk about the lock. The lock is a frame lock, but more importantly, it's a bolster lock. And if you've seen my other videos, you know that I'm a huge fan of bolster locks because the overlay actually allows you to get a nice grip on here without bearing down too much pressure on the lock bar itself, and therefore hindering your ability to deploy it. As you can see, left-handed, my thumb was even actually resting on there, and there's no issue with deploying it, even left-handed as a right-handed individual. That's one of the things that I love about bolster locks. Now, as far as the lockout itself is concerned, there is no blade play. This lockout is, well, it's perfect, and that is with a steel lock bar insert, so they did a great job there. As far as the blade centering is concerned, in a fully closed position, that blade centering is perfect, and there is, of course, no lock rock whatsoever. Nothing that I wouldn't expect from WE Knife Company. They do a really good job on these kinds of things because they've had a lot of practice. One tiny complaint that is not necessarily a deal breaker for me, but I think that they could have paid more attention to it. there's no internal chamfering on that lock bar. It wouldn't have taken much for them to just knock down that edge a little bit and create a little scalloped out spot for your fingers. As it stands, it's not super uncomfortable, but it is something that is a bit of an oversight in my opinion, because they would have lost nothing had they added that, but they would have gained a lot more as far as the actuation of that lock bar. So you know what, it is what it is. It's a frame lock, and the frame lock does work well, but on a $200+ knife, I do expect to see a little bit of consideration for things like comfort when engaging and disengaging the lock bar. And so for those reasons, it's going to be getting a 7 out of 10 for the lock. And finally, we're in our fifth and final category, which is fit and finish. Fit and finish is not just how well it was manufactured, and I can tell you it was manufactured really well. Fit and finish also has to do with the design language. Now, this is a Persian trailing point style blade. It's really curvy. I mean, go figure. It's called the Curvaceous, for crying out loud. I think that the design is very well executed, and they stayed faithful to the wishes of the designer themselves. Everything performs really well, and in my opinion, better than average. And even if JG10 isn't necessarily your style, and you know, I totally understand if it's not, I personally would have gone for the one with carbon fiber. I really appreciate the fact that we have subtle design pops, like for example, this titanium clip coming out of that overlay, I think is really neat. The idea of putting a lanyard hold there, it feels like a little bit of an afterthought. Like they designed the knife and said, well, you know, what about those people that want lanyards? You know, that it just seems like a little bit of okay, let's drill a hole there because we can. That's just something that I don't really care for, but it's also not something that I care necessarily about. I like this backspacer, and I actually like how understated it is. That backspacer isn't trying to do too much, as we typically like to see with backspacers. It's just there, and it doesn't cause any ergonomic issues. There's no extra unneeded jimping right there, and I'm actually kind of thankful that they did that. Eric Oakes designs a really clean knife, and I like the fact that they decided to make this a really good flipper because it's the only deployment option. In the same breath, I do find myself wishing that they had given us another deployment option. No matter what that deployment option would have been, I would have actually preferred having that secondary option there. But if you're one of the types that really likes flippers, this could be for you, and you'd probably be very happy with it because that flipper is really good. The action feels good, the ergos feel good, the fidget factor is decent. Things like the detent, the lockup, the blade centering, they're all about as perfect as you can get on a knife in this price range. So there is absolutely no complaints there. There are a few design oversights that I did mention, but all in all, I'm rather impressed with this knife, and I liked it a lot more than I thought that I would. For those reasons, it's going to be getting an 8 out of 10 for fit and finish. Let's go ahead and add up all the scores. For materials, we got an 8. For ergonomics was an 8. Fidget factor was a 7. The lock was a 7. And then finally, fit and finish was an 8. If you add up all of those scores, you're going to get a max score of 38 out of 50. It's a high recommend, and I do highly recommend it. At the $220 price point, I highly recommend it. And I want to put a little bit of an asterisk there because I don't know how recommendable it would be at $297, which is what these are going for on Blade HQ. I believe on Knife Center it's like $275, but even then I'd feel like that's a little more expensive. At the $220 price point that you can currently get this at White Mountain Knives, I actually think that this is a bit of a steal. And if you're interested in this knife and you're okay with JG10, or maybe if that's what you're looking for, $220 is a really good deal for this knife. Personally, I think that the sweet spot on the price point, without me needing to change the score, would be $250. I think that if they were $250, that would be fair. At $220, it's a steal. But guys, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Do you like this knife? Do you dislike this knife? Do you wish that there was more deployment options? I'm interested in hearing from you. If you liked the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, boo-hoo, you know what to do. And if you want to see more knife rankings and more Grail or garbage reviews, make sure you hit subscribe. I'm Rollshambo. I'll catch you on the flip side.